Thank you. I'm excited to be here talking with you today about the U.S.-Cuba relationship during this dynamic time. I'd like to start by going over what I plan to discuss today. First, I want to show what the U.S.-Cuba trade relationship has looked like over time. Then I'd like to give a background on Cuba's trade relationship with the world. Next, I'd like to discuss the implications of executive actions that were announced in 2014. And finally, I want to analyze what a potential normal trading relationship between the two countries could look like. Now, in recent years, between 2012 and 2014, U.S. exports averaged about $365 million per year, which means that Cuba was the 42nd largest market during that time. Now, these exports largely comprised of four products: chicken, corn, soybeans, and soy meal. Prior to the embargo, though, Cuba was the 9th biggest destination market at $139 million. It was a different basket of goods supplied during that time, and that included pork, lard, wheat flour, but most importantly, rice. Now, almost 1/3 of all U.S. rice exports over that time went to Cuba, and that exemplifies Cuba's demand for rice, as they were the largest consumer per capita of rice in the Western world then. Now, notice that the U.S. today currently supplies no rice to Cuba, despite the fact that their demand still far outstrips their domestic capacity. On the import side, in the 1950s, Cuba was the 2nd largest supplier of goods to the United States, with about 4/5 of the total value of goods imported from Cuba being cane sugar. Now, after the new government took power, relations deteriorated. There was a partial embargo in 1960, followed by a more extensive one in 1962. But the embargo from 1960 up until 1996 was largely authorized by executive action. Then, in 1996, the Helms-Burton Act, also known as Cuban Liberty and Democratic Solidarity Act of 1996, codified the embargo into law, and it also required that it would take democratic elections in order to remove the embargo. But there was another act in 2000 called PSRA, and what that did was allow for the sale of agricultural and medical goods to Cuba and a few other countries. But what it didn't do is change the import ban that currently still exists. Now, looking at U.S. agricultural exports to Cuba since PSRA, we see that over the first 8 years, there was a pretty dramatic rise. But then in the most recent years, there was a reversal and pretty steady decline until 2015, when it was about $150 million, a little bit less than $150 million worth of agricultural exports in total, and nearly entirely consisting of those four commodities I had mentioned, being chicken, corn, soybeans, and soybean meal. However, in the earlier years, there were actually a more diverse basket of goods. So there were also U.S. rice exports and non-fat dry milk and wheat that were going to Cuba during that time. So what happened? What changed? Well, one issue may be the fact that the U.S. cannot provide credit to Cuba, like many of other suppliers can. Also, in 2005, the Department of Treasury decided that the cash in advance constraint that exists on trade with Cuba would mean that Cuba's national importer, called All Import, would have to go through third-party financial intermediaries in order to gain access to U.S. goods. Another issue might be that there are geopolitical ties, as well as the fact that other suppliers are investing in Cuban infrastructure. Now, doing a comparison of U.S. exports to Cuba compared with other major suppliers, you can see here that between 2003 and 2012, the U.S. was the leading supplier. However, in 2013, the U.S. fell to second behind the EU, In 2014, it fell to third behind the EU and Brazil. And though the data is not yet fully reported for 2015, it appears that the U.S. has fallen to fourth behind the EU, Brazil, and Argentina. So what are these other competitors taking away from the U.S. market among those goods that Cuba demands? Well, the EU is now supplying a majority of wheat to Cuba. Vietnam is supplying a majority of the rice, and Brazil is supplying a very diverse basket of products. Now, TSRA in 2000 didn't affect U.S. imports of Cuban goods, but let's still look at Cuba's exports to the world. And first of all, they're largely dependent on sugar supply. Before the dissolution of the USSR, Cuba was a major sugar exporter to the world. But after the fall of the USSR and the weakening ties with Russia, Cuba struggled to find the same appetite elsewhere. Now, currently the major destinations are China with around 45% of the total and EU at 36%. Now, China is largely the top destination market because of purchases of about $400,000 metric tons worth of sugar per year. The EU is also a major market for sugar, as well as honey and tobacco. In addition, Brazil is a growing trade partner, and that is in part due to the fact that they're helping to increase Cuba's sugar production through FDI. While agricultural products make up almost 90% cane sugar, there also are a bunch of agricultural-related goods that are major sellers to the world. In fact, in 2013, Cuba exported in excess of $250 million worth of cigars and cigarettes, and also over $100 million worth of rum and tafia, and over $25 million worth of ethanol. Now, in December 2014, President Obama announced that the U.S. would start discussions to normalize diplomatic relations with Cuba. In addition, there were a number of executive actions that could have an impact on the trade relationship as well. First, restrictions on tourism were relaxed for a number of educational, religious, and humanitarian reasons. Also, remittances to Cuban non-relatives were quadrupled. Both of these allow for greater purchasing power for Cuban citizens. And in fact, recently, Marriott and Carnival Cruises have announced pursuing opportunities in Cuba. Also, the definition of cash in advance constraints was revised so that it is more like a normal CIA constraint, and all import would now not rely as much on third-party intermediaries. Exports have been expanded to include items like farming equipment, as long as that farming equipment is going to private Cuban farmers. And the U.S. will look to assist improving Cuba's telecommunications infrastructure. In fact, Google has recently reached a deal to expand internet access to Cubans. Now, all of these actions could have a positive effect on U.S. exports to Cuba, but they do not address U.S. imports, nor do they fully address the credit restrictions that still exist. Those are things that would exist under a normal trading relationship, but achieving that would require congressional action. If a normal trading relationship were to exist, what would be the result? Well, in the short run, the import ban would end. And also, exports would be expected to have a potentially large growth. US ITC in 2007 determined that there could be about $230 million worth of additional agricultural exports if restrictions were lifted. In the long run, U.S. agricultural imports would grow and further specialize in the direction of Cuba's comparative advantages. So not just sugar and tobacco, but also fruits and vegetables as more investment into the Cuban market began to exist. On the export side, with the U.S. as a most favored nation, transaction costs would reduce and would further go to enhance U.S. exports' competitive position. Also, as economic sanctions lift, GDP would improve, and with it, likely their credit rating, which would then in turn improve their purchasing power. So, what would a normal trade relationship with Cuba look like? I would suggest it'd be pretty similar to the Dominican Republic. Now, one reason for that, as you can see on row 2, they have very similar real GDP per capita. Also, on row 6, you can see the populations are about the same. They also share a number of other items, such as high literacy rates and geography. So here you want to think about the Dominican Republic figures as what the potential U.S. exports to Cuba could be if normal trade relationships existed. Well, first of all, from 2013 to 15, there were about $1.2 billion worth of goods sent to the Dominican Republic compared with $262 million sent to Cuba. But it's just not about the total. It's about the diversity among these categories, which you can see here clearly in the chart. And also, in addition to that, within these categories, there are pretty sizable differences. For instance, within the animals and animal products bar for Cuba, that bar is almost entirely made up of chickens. However, looking at the one for Dominican Republic, that's a healthy mix of chicken, beef, pork, and dairy products. Looking at grains and feed, the Dominican Republic is receiving not just bulk items like Cuba, but also processed. So finally, the Dominican Republic is much more dependent on U.S. agricultural goods than Cuba is. But under a normal trading circumstance, that 20% share would likely rise. Now, under a normal trading relationship, the U.S. would also likely regain a share of markets that had recently lost, including rice, wheat, non-fat, dry milk, and dried beans. And with growing tourism from the U.S. and fewer restrictions on trade, Cuba would likely begin to import intermediate and consumer-oriented products. U.S. imports from Cuba likely would not represent what was happening back in the 1950s because the U.S. sugar policy has changed so much and would not allow for such large imports of sugar cane. But because Cuba is a most favored nation, it is possible that they could get some share of that quota. But the main takeaway here is that Cuba would most likely diversify to a range of tropical fruits and vegetables and tobacco products instead. So in conclusion, before the embargo, the U.S. and Cuba were important trading partners. And after 2000, the U.S. ag goods were allowed to be sold again in Cuba, and there was an immediate rise again. However, in recent years, that trend has reversed. Now, as the executive actions take hold, it is possible that they have a positive impact on U.S. exports to Cuba. But to fully realize that potential would require a normal trading relationship. And that can only be done with congressional action. If you would like to learn more, please follow the link to this paper. And thank you very much for listening today.